What happens when a millionaire cowboy discovers a freezing nurse at a deserted train station and realizes strangers are hunting her down? A night of snow, blood, and impossible love unfolds, but the secret behind her past will shock you more than the bullets that follow. Stay with me, because this story does not end the way you think. Snow lashed against the platform like broken glass. The train station lights flickered, casting long shadows across the empty benches. A bitter wind howled through the steel beams, rattling loose posters on the walls. He stood tall, boots dusted with frost, hat pulled low against the storm. A millionaire cowboy, with eyes as sharp as the Texas horizon. He had come north on business, but the night carried something far heavier. Then he saw her. A young nurse, curled against the cold metal bench. Her lips were pale, trembling from the icy air. Her coat was too thin, soaked from the snow that clung to her shoulders. Her hands shook, clutching a worn leather bag to her chest. For a moment, the world slowed. The whistle of the wind seemed to fade beneath the pounding in his chest. Her eyes lifted, glazed with exhaustion. And in that instant, he felt a jolt of shock. Not from the cold, but from the sight of her face. It was the same face he had seen in his dreams for years. The same face that haunted him since the war ended. But she was not supposed to exist. Not here. Not now. He took a step closer, boots echoing on the frozen floor. The sound startled her, and she flinched. Her body pressed tighter against the bench, as if bracing for harm. The cowboy froze. His throat tightened, the air heavy with something unspoken. The storm outside roared louder, shaking the station windows. His gloved hand reached for her, but stopped midair. Because the nurse's trembling voice broke the silence with words he never expected. Her voice cracked through the cold like shattered glass. "I know you," she whispered. The words sliced deeper than the winter wind. His breath caught. Every muscle in his body turned rigid, as if the storm had frozen him in place. "How?" His voice rasped, low and uncertain. Her eyes, heavy with frost and fatigue, locked onto his. "You stood in the field hospital," she said. Her lips quivered, but her words carried a strange clarity. "You bled in my hands. Your face was burned into my memory. I never forgot." The cowboy's chest tightened, the memory slamming back with brutal force. The war. The chaos of gunfire. The smell of smoke and iron. Her hands pressing against his wound, her voice commanding him not to slip away. He had thought she was gone. He had searched for her name in endless records, finding nothing but silence. Yet here she was, half-broken, shivering against a train station bench. He knelt before her, snow crunching beneath his knees. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Her gaze dropped. "I ran," she admitted. The word hung heavy, trembling in the frozen air. "From what?" Her eyes glistened, tears freezing at the edges. "From the men who would not let me go. From the oath I made to heal, but was forced to break." The cowboy felt the storm clawing at the windows, as though the night itself wanted to swallow her confession. She shivered violently, her thin coat offering no shield. Without hesitation, he stripped off his heavy duster coat and draped it across her shoulders. She gasped at the sudden warmth, the smell of leather and faint tobacco clinging to it. For the first time, her rigid body eased. But the silence that followed was darker than the storm. Her eyes darted toward the far end of the platform. The cowboy followed her gaze. In the blur of swirling snow, figures emerged. Tall, rigid, unmoving. The kind of silhouettes that carried more menace than words ever could. The cowboy's hand slid instinctively to the holster at his side. His pulse thundered, the storm inside him louder than the one outside. The nurse's voice trembled again, almost breaking. "They found me." The nurse's whisper cut through the icy wind. "They found me." The cowboy's jaw tightened. His fingers brushed the handle of his revolver, cold steel biting against his glove. The silhouettes advanced, slow and deliberate, their boots crunching over frozen gravel. The dim station lamps flickered, stretching the shadows longer across the snow. The cowboy rose to his feet, planting himself between her and the figures. His breath steamed in the air, each exhale heavy with fire. "Stay behind me," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. The nurse clutched his coat tighter around her frail body, her wide eyes fixed on the men in the storm. The first silhouette stepped into the light. A scarred face, eyes sharp and cruel, glinted beneath the brim of a black hat. The cowboy knew that look. Hired men. The kind who lived on coin and blood. "Hand her over," the scarred man growled. His voice was gravel, low and poisonous. "She belongs to us." The words sent a chill down the cowboy's spine, colder than the snow itself. He squared his shoulders, boots planted firm on the slick floor. "No," he said, his voice steady as stone. The storm screamed outside, rattling the metal roof above. The nurse's breath quickened, fear shaking through her like brittle glass. The scarred man smirked, lifting a hand. More shadows moved behind him, 5, maybe 6 men, each one armed. The cowboy's heart pounded, but his expression never cracked. He had stared down death before. He had survived worse. But never with someone's life tethered so tightly to his own. The nurse tugged weakly at his sleeve. "You cannot fight them all," she whispered, desperation trembling in her voice. The cowboy lowered his head slightly, eyes locked on the advancing men. "I do not need to fight them all," he murmured. The scarred man laughed, a sound swallowed by the storm. "You always had pride, cowboy. But pride will not save you tonight." The nurse's hand clutched his arm tighter, nails pressing through the thick fabric. Her eyes shimmered with fear, but also something else, an unspoken trust. The cowboy took one slow breath. The scent of snow and gunpowder filled his lungs. The scarred man lifted his pistol. In that suspended moment, time fractured. The train in the distance screamed its whistle, echoing like a cry from another world. Snow blasted across the platform in a violent gust, cloaking everything in white haze. The cowboy shifted his stance, hand hovering at his holster. The nurse pressed closer, her lips near his ear. "If you fall, I will not run," she whispered. Those words cut deeper than any bullet could. Because in that moment, he realized, he was no longer fighting for his own life. He was fighting for hers. And for something greater than both. The scarred man's finger tightened on the trigger. The scarred man's finger pressed tighter against the trigger. The world seemed to freeze. The nurse's breath trembled against the cowboy's shoulder, quick and shallow, like a bird trapped in a cage. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the walls of the station as if nature itself demanded violence. The cowboy's pulse slowed, each beat deliberate, steady, like a war drum deep in his chest. He had lived this moment before, in smoky fields, in blood-soaked trenches. Only now, the stakes were different. Now, a single mistake would cost her everything. The scarred man sneered. "You always thought you were untouchable. But tonight, cowboy, you die slow." His pistol rose higher. The nurse whimpered softly, a sound so fragile it nearly cracked the cowboy's iron resolve. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver. The sound of metal scraping leather sliced through the storm. Time fractured into shards. The first shot thundered across the platform, fire bursting in the pale snow. The nurse screamed, covering her ears, the sound echoing off steel beams. The scarred man staggered, his hat flying into the snow, but he did not fall. Instead, rage twisted his face, and his men surged forward like wolves. Gunfire erupted, deafening, each shot sparking light against the swirling snow. The cowboy spun, boots skidding on ice, his revolver flashing in his hand. One man dropped, another fell to his knees, cries swallowed by the storm. The nurse crouched low, clutching her bag, her body trembling from the roar of violence. The cowboy's senses burned. The smell of smoke. The metallic taste of gunpowder on his tongue. The sharp crack of bullets shattering glass above them. Pain seared his arm as one shot grazed him, tearing through his sleeve. He gritted his teeth, eyes locked on the scarred man who still advanced, pistol steady despite the chaos. The nurse lifted her head, tears streaking down her frozen cheeks. Her eyes locked on the cowboy, pleading, desperate. "You cannot fall," she cried, her voice cracking through the gunfire. The cowboy's heart clenched. Not from the wound, but from the raw truth in her words. Another blast split the air. The cowboy dropped to one knee, snow exploding around him. His revolver smoked, the cylinder near empty. The scarred man loomed closer, a cruel smile cutting across his face. "You are bleeding, cowboy," he spat. "And soon she will be ours again." The nurse's scream ripped the night, piercing through the storm. She staggered to her feet, clutching her leather bag tight, her frail body shaking but unbroken. The cowboy's vision blurred, the world tilting under the weight of pain. But her voice dragged him back, sharp and fierce. "Stand!" she shouted. "Do not give them my life." Her cry was not weak. It was fire. It was defiance. It was enough to ignite something buried deep within him. The cowboy surged upward, blood seeping down his arm, revolver raised one final time. The storm outside howled, a furious witness to the collision of fate and fire. The scarred man's eyes widened as the cowboy's finger pulled back the trigger. The gun roared, and everything vanished in smoke and snow. The smoke curled upward, twisting through the broken light of the platform lamps. The sharp smell of burned powder stung the cowboy's nose, coating his tongue with bitterness. For a heartbeat, the world was silent. No footsteps, no gunfire, only the storm clawing at the station walls. Then a body collapsed into the snow. The scarred man lay still, his pistol slipping from his hand, sinking into the icy slush. The cowboy's revolver lowered slowly, his hand trembling from blood loss and exhaustion. But the other shadows still lingered. The scarred man's men stood frozen, faces pale, eyes wide. One shifted uneasily, boots scraping against the frozen platform. Another spat into the snow, but his bravado faltered when he saw the fire burning in the cowboy's gaze. The cowboy's stance was unyielding, his chest heaving with each breath, his wounded arm dripping red into the whiteness below. He had stared into death and did not bow. The men exchanged glances, their courage unraveling with every second of silence. Then, as if the storm itself commanded it, they turned and vanished into the veil of snow. Their retreating footsteps faded into the howl of the wind. The cowboy stood alone in the haze, revolver heavy in his hand. The nurse rushed forward, stumbling through the snow, her bag slipping from her shoulder. Her hands pressed against his bleeding arm, warm even through the cold leather of his coat. "You are hurt," she gasped, her voice trembling. Her eyes brimmed with tears that froze before they fell. "I have seen worse," he muttered, though the edges of his vision blurred. Her hands shook, fumbling to pull cloth and bandages from her bag. "Stay with me," she begged, her voice breaking. The cowboy's knees wavered, his strength drained by blood and battle. But her touch steadied him, grounding him in a storm that wanted to swallow them both. "You saved me," she whispered, her forehead pressing against his chest. He looked down, his jaw tightening as he struggled against the weight of darkness pulling him under. "No," he said softly. "You saved me. Long before tonight." The whistle of the train echoed again, louder, closer, cutting through the storm like a promise. The nurse's eyes flicked to the tracks, the glow of the approaching locomotive bleeding through the snow. She looked back at him, fear and hope clashing in her gaze. "They will come again," she whispered. The cowboy nodded slowly, blood staining the snow at his feet. "Yes. But next time, they will not find us here." Her trembling fingers tied the last knot in the bandage, her eyes never leaving his. The train roared into the station, steam billowing like a ghost across the platform. The nurse clutched his hand, urging him toward the open doors. But his boots stayed planted in the snow. His gaze swept the shadows, the wind, the empty tracks beyond. He knew this was not finished. The scarred man's death was only the spark. The fire had only begun. The nurse tugged harder, desperation tightening her grip. "If you stay, you will die," she cried. His chest rose and fell, torn between the weight of battle and the pull of destiny. At last, his eyes met hers, fierce, unyielding, full of something he had long buried. And with one final glance at the storm behind them, he stepped forward, hand in hers, into the roaring train. The doors slammed shut. The engine thundered, steel grinding against steel, carrying them into the unknown night. The storm swallowed the station behind them. But in its silence, something darker lingered. Because not all shadows had fled. One figure still stood in the distance, watching from beneath the cloak of snow. Unmoving, patient. And when the train disappeared into the horizon, the figure turned slowly, vanishing into the night, carrying the promise of vengeance. The train roared into the night, wheels hammering against steel, sparks flying beneath its weight. Inside, the air was warmer, but the cowboy felt no comfort. His arm throbbed beneath the tight bandage, blood seeping through the cloth. The nurse sat close beside him, her small hand still pressing firmly against his wound, refusing to let go. Her eyes darted to his face, pale beneath the brim of his hat. "You should rest," she whispered. His gaze remained fixed on the window, where the storm raced past in streaks of white. "Rest is for men who are safe," he answered quietly. She lowered her eyes, the truth of his words heavy in her chest. Around them, the carriage was nearly empty. A handful of passengers huddled in silence, wrapped in thick coats, their faces buried against the rattling cold. The train's lamps flickered, shadows crawling across the walls, long and uneasy. The nurse adjusted his coat around him, her touch careful, deliberate. "You did not need to risk your life for me," she murmured. His eyes shifted to hers, sharp yet softened by something unspoken. "Yes, I did," he said, voice rough as gravel. The words struck her deeper than any bullet ever could. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the thunder of the train. Then, faintly, beneath the clatter of wheels, came another sound. A rhythm too steady, too deliberate. The cowboy's brow furrowed, his hand drifting once more toward the revolver at his side. The nurse noticed, her breath catching. "What is it?" she whispered. He did not answer at first. Instead, he leaned forward, listening. The sound grew clearer. Bootsteps, slow, measured, walking the length of the carriage. The cowboy rose to his feet, his body aching but unbroken. Every passenger kept their heads low, unaware of the shadow moving toward them. The nurse gripped his sleeve. "Please," she whispered, fear trembling in her voice. But the cowboy shook his head. "I told you," he murmured. "They will not stop." The door at the far end of the carriage slid open with a metallic groan. Snow swirled in, carried on a burst of cold air. And there he stood, a tall figure in a long dark coat, hat dripping with melting snow. His face was hidden in shadow, but the glint of steel at his side betrayed his intent. The nurse's breath hitched. The cowboy's hand rested firm on his revolver, his eyes narrowing. The man stepped forward, boots clicking against the wooden floor, each step echoing louder than the storm outside. Passengers shifted uneasily, sensing danger but too afraid to raise their eyes. The nurse whispered against the cowboy's arm, her voice faint but fierce. "Who is he?" The cowboy's jaw clenched. "I do not know," he admitted. "But I know why he is here." The man in the dark coat stopped halfway down the carriage. The lamps flickered again, shadows bending across his face. A thin smile curved beneath the brim of his hat. "You made a mistake, cowboy," the man said, his voice smooth, calm, terrifying in its certainty. "You should have left her behind." The nurse's heart pounded, her body frozen, her mind flashing back to the scarred man's cruel words at the station. The cowboy took one step forward, boots heavy against the wooden planks. His revolver gleamed faintly in the dim light, steady in his grip despite the blood still dripping from his arm. "If you came here for her," he said, his voice low, steady, like thunder before the strike, "then you will not leave this train alive." The storm outside wailed, battering the train as it thundered into the night. The man in the coat tilted his head, amused, as though death itself were a game. And then his hand moved toward his gun. The cowboy's muscles tightened, the nurse's fingers digging desperately into his arm. The carriage seemed to hold its breath. Steel screamed against steel. The lamps flickered once more. And the night plunged into violence. The train rocked violently as the storm howled outside. Gunfire cracked through the carriage, shattering glass, sending sparks across the floor. Passengers screamed, ducking low, clutching their coats as chaos consumed the night. The cowboy moved with grim purpose, his boots steady despite the pain in his arm. Each shot he fired carried the weight of survival, the weight of the woman behind him. The stranger's bullets tore splinters from the wooden walls, but none found their mark. The cowboy pressed forward, every step fueled not by pride, but by promise. The promise he had made when he locked eyes with her in the freezing station. The stranger lunged, desperate, his face twisting in fury as the last bullet left his gun. The cowboy did not flinch. His revolver thundered one final time. The echo roared down the carriage, drowning out the storm. The stranger staggered, eyes wide, then fell silent on the floor. The train groaned, wheels screaming as it tore through the dark, carrying them farther from death. The cowboy lowered his weapon, chest heaving, blood dripping onto the boards beneath his feet. The nurse rushed to him, her hands trembling as she caught his arm. Her eyes shimmered with fear and relief all at once. "It is over," she whispered. He looked down at her, the fire in his eyes slowly softening. "For now," he said, voice rough, but his gaze held something gentler, something she had never seen in any man before. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her tears damp against his coat. The storm outside began to fade, the first light of dawn breaking across the horizon. The train slowed, steam hissing as the brakes screeched against steel. A new town lay ahead, distant yet waiting. A place where the past could not reach them. A place where love might grow, even from the ashes of fear. The cowboy wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her close as the train pulled into the station. Together, they stepped forward, leaving behind the shadows that had hunted them. For in that night of blood and snow, they had carved a story that would outlive the storm. A story of a cowboy and a nurse. A story of love born in the fire of survival. A story that made history.